This is the story of the final, decisive battle that brought an end to the war in Europe during the Second World War. In April 1945, the Red Army encircled and entered Berlin. Over the next weeks, soldiers and civilians faced an ordeal of relentless urban combat, desperate defenses, and the collapse of a regime. This is how the city fell. April 16, 1945, Soviet forces launched the final offensive toward Berlin. On broad front lines stretching from the Vistula to the Oder, multiple Soviet fronts pushed westward, concentrating men, armor, and artillery for a decisive blow. Commanders planned to strike deep and fast, to smash Army Group Vistula and reach the German capital before Western Allied forces could intervene. The German situation was bleak. Months of retreat, depleted units, and shattered logistics left defenders with mixed formations, Wehrmacht remnants, hastily formed Volkssturm units, SS detachments, and Waffen-SS survivors. Many soldiers were exhausted, short of ammunition, and increasingly isolated. Civilian morale was fragile, food was scarce, and the city swelled with refugees fleeing the Eastern Front. By late April, the Soviets had closed the ring around Berlin. The city became an island under siege. Soviet artillery and air power roared in. Street by street, district by district, Soviet infantry and tanks forged into the urban maze. Soviet tactics combined massive bombardments to neutralize strongpoints with small unit assaults that cleared buildings and held ground under fire. The pace of the fighting was relentless and chaotic, suited to neither side's expectations. Inside Berlin, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi leadership clung to command. Bunkers and subterranean passages became the nerve centers of a collapsing regime. Orders were issued, counterattacks planned, and symbolic gestures made to show continued resistance. For the men defending the city, the battle quickly became a grim scramble. Positions shortened, communications failed, and isolated units fought improvisational fights for every block. Urban combat transformed familiar streets into lethal terrain. Tanks struggled on narrow avenues and could be ambushed from upper floors. Infantry used cellars, sewers, and basements to move and strike. Artillery and flamethrowers tore into fortified buildings. Civilian structures, apartments, schools, and churches served as fighting positions, hospitals, and refuges. For many civilians, the last weeks of the war were days of fear, sheltering in cellars, queuing for rations, and listening to explosions that shook foundations. Key actions shaped the fall of the city. Soviet forces pushed towards central objectives, the Tiergarten, the Reichstag, and the government quarter. Street fights intensified around major thoroughfares and transport hubs. The Reichstag, long a symbolic prize, drew fierce fighting as Soviet troops sought to plant a visible sign of victory. Flags were raised in captured positions. Images and reports of these moments would later stand as icons of the conflict's end. As the Soviet talons tightened, German command structures frayed. Field commanders recognized the military reality, but Hitler refused surrender. Within the bunker complex, there were breakpoints. Commanders argued, orders were ignored, and some tried to negotiate local surrenders. Desertion and surrender became more common as hope waned and supplies vanished. Civilians bore an enormous toll. The winter of destruction gave way to a different, crowded winter of bombardment, cold, and hunger. Hospitals overflowed, medical supplies were gone. Many families lost loved ones in the shelling, and many more were displaced as buildings burned or collapsed. Those who survived the fighting faced a shattered city, no heat, no running water in many districts, and a shattered social order. By early May, the battle was concluding. On May 2, 1945, German forces in Berlin surrendered to the Soviet command. Pockets of resistance lingered for hours or days in isolated buildings, but the organized defense had crumbled. The surrender marked not only a military defeat, but the end of the Third Reich's capacity to wage war in Europe. The human cost was staggering. Military casualties on both sides were high, and civilian deaths and suffering added to the tragedy. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruins, cultural treasures and historical buildings were damaged or destroyed. For survivors, the end of combat brought immediate relief, but also the long work of recovery and reckoning. In the aftermath, Berlin lay divided, physically, politically, and emotionally. The city became a focal point in the coming Cold War, split into sectors controlled by the Allies. Monuments of conquest, raised flags, captured emblems, served as powerful reminders of victory, loss, and the shifting map of Europe. The battle's images and stories traveled quickly around the world, shaping how the war's ending would be remembered. The Battle for Berlin was more than a military operation. It was the violent closing chapter of a catastrophic era. It shows how total war transformed both soldier and civilian life, how cities became battlefields, and how ideology and desperation can drive conflict to extremes. It also offers a lesson in human resilience. Survivors and rebuilding efforts would soon begin the painful task of restoring lives and communities. Today, when we examine maps, photographs, and personal testimonies, we confront a complex legacy. The fall of Berlin brought the end of a murderous regime and the liberation for many who had suffered under it. Yet liberation came amid devastation and loss. Subscribe to History Safe for more restored color footage, rare archival material, and in-depth history content.